If you are watching online, well, welcome to our service. So part 2 of polygamy. Last week we looked at a big picture in the Bible, how polygamy was not God's original intent for Adam and Eve, and it was something the descendants of Cain came up with. It wasn't God's people's idea. We looked at, it is mentioned in the law of Moses, but it was mentioned in a way that protects the vulnerable. It protects the women that are trapped in those relationships beyond their control. It protects the children born in those relationships. So God does not excuse this sin, and he does forbid it, specifically for kings. So we looked at those last week. So now we're going to look at specific examples of, and this can trip people up, especially young people who aren't quite as grounded in their faith, that they can read the Bible and then get knocked for a loop a little bit. Well, we know polygamy is wrong, but why does it seem like Abraham gets away with it, or Jacob gets away with it, or David gets away with it, and it seems like they get a pass, that God's inconsistent in his moral standards. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at those specific examples. Tonight we'll look at the patriarchs and in the book of Judges. And then next week is pretty much all going to be the life of David. He's kind of the prime example of polygamy there, and we'll see what it does to wreck his life, and then we'll just look a little bit at Solomon, who multiplies the sin of his father after that, sadly. So first example we'll see tonight is Abraham and Hagar. And so this was that God had promised Abram when he was younger, promised him that you're going to be the father of many people, that through your descendants I'm going to bless the entire world, the covenant with Abraham. Well, Abraham's getting up in years, and especially his wife Sarah is getting up in years, and Abraham's 10 years older than Sarah, and they hit their 90s, and then getting close on 100, and they still don't have any children yet. And so, unfortunately, their faith wavers a bit, and Sarah decides to they want to help God out. Well, God, we know you promised us a child, but let's help you along with this process. That never turns out well when we try to help God out. We need to be patient and wait on the Lord. And there's so many layers to this. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, so it was Abram and Sarai before they became Abraham and Sarah. But now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So many levels of problems. Where did they get an Egyptian maidservant? Oh, when Abraham was lapsed in faith and went down to Egypt in the time of the famine. If they'd have never gone to Egypt in the first place, they'd have never gotten Hagar, and there's a lot of dots that are connected there. Lot would have never seen the land of Egypt, and Lot would have not chosen the plain by Sodom and Gomorrah that was similar to the land of Egypt. So a lot of problems from that trip. Verse 2. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. So here let's help God out, and we're going to have a child. And this is what sometimes in the Bible is called a concubine relationship, even though this is a little different than like the kings and their concubines. In some ways, it's kind of more of a surrogate mother relationship, but not exactly the same. So Abraham is going to have physical sexual relations with Hagar, and she's going to bear him a son, but they're going to count it as Sarah's son, is what they're going to do. And in fact, this I know this is going to seem extremely weird, especially to all of our ladies, but what they would do is, and this is said in the Bible, the actual wife, the legitimate wife who's not able to have children, she would sit down or lay down, and then the handmaiden or the concubine who's going to bear the child would actually sit on top of her, sit on her lap in the birth process. And I was in there when Abby was born and when the twins were born, so I know that's not a pleasant process to go through, the dilation and the delivery. But that's what they would do. I don't have this on the screen, but when Jacob's wife Rachel, when she gives her handmaid, they want to do the same thing, gives her handmaid to Jacob to bear children. Rachel says in Genesis chapter 30, verse 3, "Here's my maid Bilhah, go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees." So it says literally in the delivery process, the slave girl is going to sit on the knees of the legitimate wife. That does not sound fun in on any level. But that's what they did that for. Is they're wanting to do everything to show this is the legitimate heir, that even though he was not grown in the womb of the legitimate wife, that they're doing everything to try to make it as if so, that he's going to be born between the knees of the legitimate wife, and he's going to be considered the son of the legitimate wife. And so it's odd to us, I know, absolutely, but that's what they would do. And so and it's sad for these women, for Hagar and for Bilhah and the other women. They had no say in this. They're just used as property, and it's a really sad arrangement that they're trapped in. Verse 9 says, and Sarah saw, they have Ishmael. So Abraham and Hagar have their son Ishmael, and then Ishmael, he grows older, and then the Lord does fulfill his promise, and Isaac is born because of Abraham, through Abraham and Sarah, legitimately, even though they were way past the age of being able to bear children. And so Isaac is born. So then later, chapter 21, verse 9, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing, or he was mocking Isaac. Therefore she said to Abram, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. And so they have to send away Hagar and send away Ishmael, but there's strife between them from that moment, a strife between Ishmael, the illegitimate son, and strife between Isaac, the legitimate son, both children of Abraham, one considered the heir and one considered the illegitimate one, but yet that strife still plays out today. Here we are 3,800-ish years, almost 4,000 years later, and there's still strife between the Arabs, the descendants of Ishmael, and the Jews, the descendants of Isaac, and there's still war, and there's still strife. And some of those countries, and I've watched a couple documentaries on the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War and some of the more modern wars over there, and some of those nations don't even recognize Israel as a legitimate place. They don't even recognize them as a nation. Assyria and Egypt and some of those leaders are just like, we don't even believe you exist. And it's sad. All of the terrorism and the bombings and things that still happen today, all the way goes back to this moment and this sin between Sarah and Hagar. And Hagar, she... this was beyond her control. In fact, we see that the Lord blesses her faith. She didn't have a say in these events, really, but when she thought she was going to die and Ishmael was little and thought they were going to starve to death, that the Lord sent an angel and saved them. And so that the Lord blessed her faith in spite of the mistakes of Abraham and Sarah and all these wrongdoings all around them. And today, the Muslim countries there in Saudi Arabia and Jordan and all the other Muslim countries, they try to rewrite the history of the Bible, and they try to make Ishmael as the hero. So like when Abraham goes up the mountain, the Bible says it was Isaac that he takes on the mountain and offers Isaac his son and the ram caught in the thicket. Well, Muslims rewrite all that it's Ishmael that goes up with him, and that Ishmael is this on every part. And so... just strife that goes on there, and it's sad. And it just looks like last week we sort of looked at the kings, and we'll look at some of the judges here. But in many of these things, the Babylonian palace and the Egyptian palace and Pharaoh's palace, or this emperor or the Philistine king, all of them, they behave. It's almost just like animal herds. Is kind of the basic, as close as we could say. Of you've got the alpha male, the king, the top dog there, that he's going to have all the women for himself, and that he has all the rights to mate with them that he wants, just as like a herd of elk or a herd of wolves or some kind of animal creature. And no one else is allowed to have any wives. They all belong to the one. And then when he dies, then the strife between all the half-brothers of who's going to be the next king. And that's not how God intended for people to live. That's not how God intended for society to be. So, but we see that. So yes, Abraham did commit polygamy in a sense, but he does not get away with it, and they're still fighting today over that one instance. We also see in the life of Jacob, so Isaac and Rebekah are the next generation. They're a monogamous relationship. So even though Isaac had his faults, at least they get a sticker for that, for not multiplying wives together. But sadly, their sons, Esau and Jacob, do not follow that example of monogamy. And so Jacob ends up with 4 wives before it's all done. And what a mess that ends for him. So we see Genesis chapter 29, verse 24. So Jacob has had to run away from his brother Esau. He has tricked his father, Isaac, and stolen the birthright that belonged to Esau. And Jacob makes Isaac's favorite stew, and he puts the hairy goat skin on his arms to deceive his father because Esau was a hairy man. And so Jacob's tricked him. And so Esau says, next time, as soon as dad dies, I'm going to kill you. Basically, as soon as dad is in the grave, you're dead. And so Jacob runs away, runs to Uncle Laban out and away from the promised land, the land of Canaan. And he's there and he meets his cousin Rachel, whom he falls in love with and wants to marry. And that's all fine and good, except till we get to the wedding day, verse 24. And so it says, Genesis chapter 29, verse 24, and Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid, and Zilpah is going to become one of Jacob's concubine wives. And then verse 25, so Jacob worked 7 years for his uncle Laban in what he's thinking in labor for winning Rachel's hand, but verse 25, so it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. This is one of the most mysterious verses in all the Bible of like, how? What? How did that happen? I don't have an explanation. And some Bible scholars try to be like, well, they did weddings in the evening and the sun was going down and she had a long veil on, and so Jacob couldn't clearly see. And there may have been a little bit to that, but to me, the only explanation I can come up with is copious amounts of alcohol. I can't think of any other. How on earth could you do this? Not even know who you spend your wedding night with until the next morning. I mean, seriously, like really, they've got to be just completely slovenly drunk, or I don't know. It's beyond me. Anyways, so one of the great mysteries of the Bible right there. How was it Leah in the morning? How did he not notice maybe a little bit before that? Behold, it was Leah. And Jacob, said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? And so here Jacob, whose name means deceiver or trickster, that literally the one who grabs another's heel, as he was hanging on to Esau's heel when they were born, he's no match for old Uncle Laban, who's been a trickster a lot longer than him. So Jacob had tricked his father and tricked his brother, and now it's catching up to him. And so he gets tricked by Uncle Laban, gets deceived, and spends his wedding night with the wrong sister until... But he should have stopped there, but no, he doesn't quit while he's just a few points down. He has to keep sinking. So verse 27, Laban said, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. So Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. So this is so sad that Leah is one of the tragic characters in the Bible that she gets 1 week with her husband exclusively, and then so Jacob and Leah are married man and wife for 7 days, and then after 7 days there's another wedding ceremony, and Jacob marries the younger sister Rachel that he wanted, and then Leah's just kind of pushed to the corner there. But Jacob has to give his word that he will work another 7 years, even though he's already married to both sisters. He has to agree to work a total in 14 years for this. And so poor Leah, Leah the unloved is what she's often called, that she was not married to a man who didn't love her, and she'd always lived in Rachel's shadow, that Leah, tender-eyed, or not the most attractive necessarily. We're not exactly sure what that verse means, but Rachel, she's the beauty queen. She's the Miss Moab, or whatever contest they would have. And she's the one everyone wants to be her friend. She's got the looks, and yet Leah's always lived in Rachel's shadow, and instead of had looked forward as they're growing up as sisters, looked forward to separating and Rachel going her way and marrying her family and Leah going her way, and now they're stuck married to the same guy. What a rotten deal. Absolutely. But the Lord remembered Leah with that, and the Lord does not leave her abandoned. And so it continues on, though. Verse 29, Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. So Leah gets a handmaiden, a bridesmaid, to be with her in the wedding, and then Rachel gets a bridesmaid with her. And Jacob ends up marrying all four of them before it's all said and done, because Leah and Rachel get into a contest of who can have the most kids, and Leah's way ahead. Because the Lord had closed Rachel's womb. And so Rachel gives Bilhah to be Jacob's wife. So Bilhah will have children in exchange for Rachel. And then so Leah does the same thing, gives her handmaid to Jacob. So he's got 4 wives, and he ends up having 6 sons by Leah, 2 sons by each of the slave wives, and then 2 sons by Rachel, and 1 daughter by Leah on top of that, there with everything. So quite a bit of 4 women. It's like, what is this, a Jerry Springer episode or something? It's basically what we have here. And verse 30, Jacob also went into Rachel. He loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. So 4 wives in total. Now, in Islam today, Muslim, like in the backwoods, Afghanistan and the places where the conservative, the hardcore fundamentalist guys are, that branch of Islam, 4 wives is the limit that you're allowed to have. Now, of course, there's always exceptions. The Prophet Muhammad gets an exception. He has 19 wives in total, the youngest of which was 11, I believe, when he married her. But every cult there's an exception. Joseph Smith gets an exception from all what the rest of the Mormons have to do. Muhammad gets an exception from what everyone else has to do. And so, but that was how when the CIA was trying to find Osama bin Laden, that's how they found him. That they had this house in Pakistan that they were watching, and they knew Osama bin Laden's right-hand man was there in that house. And so they've been watching it with the satellites, and the right-hand man, he would go outside, and there were these women that would go outside, but they suspected there was someone else in there who would never go outside because he knew the satellites were watching it. But as they were watching it for over a year, they were able to identify 5 separate marriageable women that were there in that household. And so they're like, well, they're conservative Muslims, and the limit is 4, so that means there's a second male somewhere in the home. And so they sent the SEAL team in, and Osama was there. There was a second male there, but that was the evidence that they had to go off of. And but here, though, Jacob, he's obviously not a Muslim, but yet he's got the same limit, 4 wives. And what a mess and to some selfish perverts, this might seem like kind of a good deal on the surface. Like, yeah, man, you got all these women and if one's mouths off to you, well, you're off in your own tent tonight. I don't have to deal with you. I got 3 others to choose from, or something, or play them off each other or something. But no, it doesn't work out that way whatsoever. Jacob was the one who got played in the end. Absolutely. And so that's sad. And Leah and Rachel, there's very little dialogue directly between them, but in the little bit that they do talk, they're recorded in the book of Genesis. There's one time they sit down and they say, our father sold us. Our dad, he didn't love us. He sold you for 7 years of labor, and he sold me for 7 years of labor. So they realize what this is about, and it's sad for him. But God does honor, even though Leah was not loved by her husband, she was the first wife, she was the legitimate wife, and God honors her for that. And really, Jacob should have stopped at Leah. So chapter 29, verse 35, the book of Genesis, talking about Leah here, that she conceived again and bore a son and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Now, Judah, that's significant because that's going to be Jesus. The Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah. King David is going to be from the tribe of Judah, and eventually Jesus himself from the tribe of Judah. So it was through Leah's womb, that the tribe of Judah, and that the Messiah is going to come. God's promise was fulfilled just as he said. So Jacob should have stopped at Leah being his only wife there. Leah is more spiritual than Rachel in a lot of ways, that every time Leah bears a son, she names him something in reference to God. God has given me this, or I will praise the Lord. Or all of her sons that she bears, Levi and Reuben, the others that come from Leah's womb, she acknowledges God when God answers her and gives her children. So she has a spiritual awareness with God. Rachel, on the other hand, she only has two children, Joseph and Benjamin, so she does name them after the things of God, but Rachel partly practices paganism and idolatry. When he and Laban can't get along anymore because Jacob's cattle are too big for Laban's ranch land, they got to part ways in time, and so and the Lord wanted to get Jacob back to the promised land. When they finally part ways, Rachel goes and steals all of her father Laban's idols, the family idols and the statues that they had there in the house. She steals all them, takes them with them, and even sits on the very box that they're in when her father comes looking for them and looking through their tent. And so she brings paganism into the family, and that becomes a snare that later on Jacob has to, after they make peace with Esau, and then after they try to settle down around Shechem, there's some strife and problems there. That Jacob's one daughter Dinah gets raped by the prince of the town of Shechem, and then his sons go in and kill all the men of Shechem. It's a bad deal in a lot of ways. But then finally Jacob's like, okay, that's it. We're getting rid of all the idols. We're going back to God. We're going back to Bethel, where I was supposed to go in the first place. We're going to build the altar. But that part of that was Rachel's fault. That brought the paganism into the family. But Leah, we don't see that with her. Also, Genesis 35, verse 22, as if it wasn't bad enough, and it happened later on when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel heard about it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. So Reuben is Leah's son and the oldest of all of Jacob's children. And yet he sleeps with his father's own concubine, slave wife there, the Bilhah that was Rachel's bridesmaid. And so here we got just all this chaos in the family. And through this, Reuben is going to forfeit the birthright that he would have been the spiritual leader of all the sons and what become the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. He forfeits that. Instead, it goes to Joseph. There later, even though Joseph is sold away and they're not reunited till later on, that is through Joseph that he is the spiritual leader of that generation. But really, as messed up as this is, what right does Jacob have to tell his son, hey, this is messed up, don't do this? He's forfeited that. I'm a man of no sexual self-control, so, I can't tell you, son, that this is wrong or whatever, because that's the condition they were in. So it's sad. The circumstance there. And so we've got all the two sisters married in the same house. Leah and Rachel spent their whole life with drama. I don't know if they were friendly sisters or if they were on to one another and fighting, but either way, it's not good being married to the same guy. And we can see that they even sometimes they'll make deals with each other, a little bit recorded in the book of Genesis, like, okay, well, if you help out with this, then you can have tonight with him, and I'll help out with this. And it's a bad deal in a lot of ways. So, and we see, however, Leah, God still honors Leah though through this. Toward the end of the book of Genesis, we see, and often, as we'll see on every single one of these examples, the husband or the man with the multiple wives, he gets the consequences partly, and the children get the consequences fully, is what happens so many times. That the sins of the fathers go on to the next generation. So Jacob escaped the immediate problems because of this polygamy, but the sons, it was terrible strife of all the, you're just a half brother. No, this is my full brother, and all the conflict through that. Genesis chapter 7, verse 3 says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children. Okay, that's another problem. Shouldn't have done that, but where did he learn that? Well, his dad Isaac loved Esau, the man's man. His mom Rebecca, she loved Jacob, the plain man, intense. And so that favoritism, the problem, the mistakes of the parents are often amplified in the children. And so he loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic or coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all their brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So when the kids are little, this polygamy thing doesn't seem to be such a bad deal. But as they become young men and teenagers, then we're getting some strife and we're getting some problems. And it gets so bad to the point that before Joseph is sold into slavery, his brothers can't even speak to him on civilized terms. They can't even have a calm word with him. And so that's a problem. That's a family dynamic that is broken. And then we see that later they want to kill Joseph, and the only reason they don't kill him is so we can kill him and he can be dead, or we can sell him and make a little bit of money. So let's sell him then, and why waste him? And so it's just bad. That's the strife, and there's multiple other problems that come to pass with that, but God is able to work in spite of all the mistakes. Joseph is able to rescue the family there in Egypt. And then we see at the end of Jacob's life, Jacob comes down to Egypt right before he dies and is able to see Joseph there for the last few years of his life. And so Jacob explains to Joseph, says, I want you to go take me, bury me back in the land of Canaan when I die, and bury me in the same burying place where Abraham's buried, your great-grandpa Abraham and Isaac, and you're buried there in the family sepulcher. And so Jacob is explaining this, Genesis 49, verse 31. It says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried, not Rachel, Leah. Leah is buried in the family tomb, the legitimate wife. Leah was the first wife, the wife Jacob should have had from the beginning, the wife the Messiah comes from. She is buried in the family tomb. Rachel, she dies earlier. She dies when Benjamin is born near the town of Bethlehem, what eventually becomes Bethlehem. She passes away there. And but Leah lives longer and is buried there in the family tomb or the mausoleum. And so the burial is important in the Bible, where we see that in the book of Kings, Chronicles. If you were a good king, you got buried with the good kings. If you're a bad king, they just threw you in a ditch or burned you or various things. But where you're buried speaks of how you lived. And we see the pictures of Joseph at next chapter, chapter 50, at the end of Joseph's life. He's buried in a coffin in Egypt. The book of Genesis begins in paradise in the Garden of Eden, and it ends in death in a coffin in Egypt. And Egypt is a picture of sin. So the place you're buried, that speaks of how you lived. And so Leah, she is buried with the family as the legitimate wife there. That's what God intended, and Jacob would have been a lot better off if he'd have just stuck with that, even though she didn't necessarily have the looks on the outside that Rachel had, but that's only temporary anyway. So at the end, it would have been a lot better than all the conflict that came in his family as a result of it. So that's the patriarchs. Then we get to the book of Judges. There we'll just look at, there's many examples in the book of Judges, but we'll just look at a few of them. Gideon, he's one of those, like, when you're a kid and growing up in church and Christian school, you learn about these Bible heroes, Noah and Gideon and men of faith. And then you get older and you start reading the Bible for yourself, and you read the things they never told you in children's church. They never told you, oh, yeah, Gideon, he did great. But then at the end of his life, he really backslid quite a bit and got away from it. Oh, they didn't teach us that. They didn't teach us those things. They didn't teach us about Noah getting drunk or all the, some of the not so stellar moments of the Bible heroes often didn't make it into the children's church version. So Gideon, he's one of those. He does so amazing. Him and his 300 troops lead Israel to victory against the Midianites, and the great battle and victory that God gives there. But then at the end, so they got all this spoil of all these 135,000 dead Midianites, and Gideon takes the gold for that for himself, and he makes idols out of that gold, and the people turn to idols. And then he doesn't set himself up as king, but he does use his leadership and his influence to enrich himself, to where, sadly, Judges chapter 8, verse 30, says Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. many wives. So apparently did not do a lot of leading the country after he beat the Midianites, because all he is doing is popping out kids. Seriously, 70 sons. I mean, that's, do the math. I mean, we don't know exactly how long this is, but over this 20 years, so is he having a son, 2 or 3 sons born every year with this? I mean, that's a lot of work to do, man. So chapter 9, that's verse 4. We see Gideon's family. So he's got all these 70 sons. Well, Gideon dies. It's like, oh, this is great. They're a fine man. He's, the Playboy mansion, essentially. He gets to be the Hugh Hefner of his time, and it's wonderful, has all these wives. It's great until he passes away. And then just like Jacob's family, the strife there between all the sons. Well, I'm a legitimate son. No, I'm a legitimate son. I'm going to be the next judge, and all the strife that comes through that. We see verse 4 that Gideon's son Abimelech, who is not a legitimate son, but yet he hates all the rest of his 69 brothers that he rises up, and what does he do? Chapter 9, verse 4, so they gave him, and he's there at one of the towns there in the land of Israel, so they gave Abimelech 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. So they elect Abimelech the king of this little region, and he's well on his way to being a successful politician, because he takes all the money out of the treasury and he goes and he buys a bunch of criminals to run around with him. But very, good. He learns quick how to be a successful politician, right? Go buy the lowest, scummiest people in society and hire them to work for you. Yes, that's a politics 101 right there. He is on the way, on the way to success. He will go far. So Abimelech hired worthless, reckless men. They followed him. Verse 9, then he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, another name for Gideon, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left because he hid himself. And so here, the massacre within the brother killing brother is what happens here. It kills all 68 of his own flesh and blood right there, and just one little brother is able to escape, and it's terrible. And Gideon, it doesn't happen in his life, but then the next generation what suffers. That's so very often in many sins, whether it's in adultery or anything in marriage, it can affect the people, but the children lose out so much with that, far more than the parents do. It's tragic. And not just Gideon, but so much. The entire book of Judges is just one cycle over and over. The people will turn away from God, go into idolatry and serve idols, and God will bring someone to oppress them. The Midianites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, some other group will come in, oppress them, put them in slavery. Eventually it'll get so bad they'll repent, they'll turn back to God, God will bring a judge, they'll be delivered, and then they drop the baton. The next generation, they have to learn the same lessons over and over again. And they're the gerbil stuck in the wheel. They're just spinning, but going nowhere. And a big factor in that is the breakdown of the family. When the nuclear family, when the biblical marriage, and one man, one woman, children raised in a godly way, when that collapses, it's impossible to pass the baton. It's impossible to hand the faith to the next generation. And we see that so many of these men, yeah, they won battles and they were great military masterminds and brought Israel victories on the battlefield and freedom for a time, but yet they just can't get that baton of faith to the next generation because they have no character and they have no self-control when it comes to at home and when it comes to keeping their lust in check. They just give in to their lust every single time, and it's tragic. And for 300 some odd years, they just keep going over and over and over in this. They never learn. Judges chapter 12, verse 8. Some of these lesser known judges that really aren't mentioned very much. It says, and after him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, and he gave away 30 daughters in marriage. And so 60 kids there, 30 sons, 30 daughters, obviously by multiple women. And so he brings in 30 daughters-in-law to marry his sons. He judged Israel 7 years. Down in verse 13, some other lesser judges mentioned. Verse 13, after him, Abdon the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, something like that, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 young donkeys. He judged Israel 8 years. And so what does it say about a man when, God, every single word in the Bible is given for a reason. And God, he tells us what he tells us about Jesus and about the Messiah and the prophecies. It's all in there for a reason. What does it say about a man when the only thing God chooses to put in his eternal word about him is his lack of sexual self-control? We have 2 verses on Abdon, 2 verses on Ibzan, and that is all that we know about them. That it doesn't even say they won this battle or they did this. Just said they lived this long, judged this many times, and oh yeah, they had a bunch of kids with a bunch of wives. That's it. And we see as the family collapses, the society collapses, and that's what we see in our country as we get away from the we don't want to pretend that there were never any problems back in the past. It's never as if America was a perfect golden age. No one ever had any issues, or there were never any bad things done in the past. There's always been issues and there's always been sin, but back in the Leave It to Beaver days with the dad and the mom and the kids there and the family gathered around the family table when things were stable, what was our country then compared to what it is now? And especially in, and it's sad with, and this is not to blame any particular group except blame the politicians that put the place in to cause this, but like African American families back in, I believe it was the 50s and even as early as the 60s, 80% or 8 out of every 10 African American children were born into a nuclear family, mom and dad at home. And then today it is completely flipped, that 8 out of 10 are born into just a single motherhood deal. And that's not to say like, oh, they're being so wicked. That's because of government policies that were passed in the 60s and things to trap them in to buy votes and to trap them in those terrible situations and trap them in the inner cities and in the projects. And that has led to when you get politicians saying, they called it the war on poverty, but really they should have named it the war on fatherhood, is what it should have been named, because hey, we're gonna pay dads to stay away. We're gonna step in and take the place of dad. Well, we're gonna destroy the family, is what we're gonna do. And that we see, and that's not just that's every demographic in America, that we've seen the breakdown of the family in so many ways, and the chaos. The family is the building block of everything. It's the building block of your country. It's the building block of your church. It's what God uses as the basic building block there. And when our blocks are crooked or falling apart, then we don't have a stable. And I'm not throwing stones at all at single moms. There's some single moms who are incredible heroes of the faith and what they do to raise their children and to serve their Lord. And for any other single dads or anyone who's outside of that cookie cutter ideal, God can work through that, and God will bless people who will honor what is right. But we just see as a whole, as we zoom out big enough, as we see our country as a whole, as we see so many more of these broken families compared to what it was in the past, then we see the higher drug use, the higher crime, the higher lawlessness, and the higher problems that become so many. Dads not being at home fatherless is the root of so many. The likelihood to end up in poverty, the likelihood to end up in jail, the likelihood to not finish high school, and lots of things that people don't even get started in life because if they just had dad, the difference a dad makes is incredible. So, but we see that. The book of Judges was the same time. Just the family collapses, the country collapses. Let's look at one last one here, Samuel. So this is at the tail end of the book of Judges. Samuel is the last judge there, though in the next book, in the book of 1 Samuel. And Samuel, his parents are, so he's born into a relationship of polygamy. So he's got his dad, Elkanah, there, who has 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. And this is the only example of this time period where the children are not trying to kill each other. Imagine that. That's what that we see. So they actually do get along, which breaks the mold of what we've seen from like Jacob's kids and Gideon's children. We see 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim, or Ramath Zophim, as it says, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zoph, Ephraimite. He had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. However, verse 6 says, and her rival, so Peninnah, provoked her, Hannah, severely and made her miserable because the Lord had closed her womb. So, yes, they're not at each other's throats trying to kill each other, but this is not a pleasant situation. For Elkanah, this is not going to be this is not going to be peaceful house that I just can't wait to get home at the end of the day and be among the harmony that's here. And that's sad. That's what God intends for home to be a place where we can let our guards down, to not have to put a mask on or put a front up for anyone, that we can be ourselves at home and be a place of peace, and for brothers and sisters to get along, and to be a place of happiness. And it's sad. It's sad. So many of these families in the Bible that's destroyed. It's sad for children today, these parents who give their devices way too early, and these kids are connected all the time, as they're on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever the new thing is. They never get a break. So now they come home and their friends digitally follow them home, and their friends are there in their room, and their friends are watching everything they do, and their friends are with them all the time. These kids never get to be themselves. They're always having to put on a front because their peers are always around them, and that's not healthy. That's not how the family is supposed to be. That's not how God intends it to be, and wise parents will put a stop to the devices. No, you don't need a smart internet-connected phone when you're 9. Sorry, you don't, and maybe not even when you're 15. When it's time, and even when you get one, there's time limits and appropriateness, and home is a place where it's a sanctuary, and a place where we can kind of take a break and get away from that. So, in Samuel's life, God answers Hannah's prayer, verse 27 there again of chapter 1. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition which I asked of him. So Samuel is given to Hannah as a answer to the prayer that she had prayed. And we see here that God is able to bless the faith of these women. Hannah doesn't have a choice in this marriage. We don't know the circumstances exactly, but the women were property in a lot of sense in this time, and it was sad. But this is beyond Hannah's control, but yet God sees her faith and blesses her faith in spite of her being in circumstances out of her control. God sees Hagar's faith, blesses Hagar in spite of being in circumstances out of her control. And Elkanah, yes, he did many things right as Samuel's father, that they would go every year to the tabernacle, the 3 times a year, and they would bring the sacrifices, and they kept the law more than most families at least, but he did fail. He failed when it came to the home. And when you read 1 Samuel chapter 1 and chapter 2, Elkanah is not the spiritual leader of his household. Hannah is the spiritual leader. Elkanah is just kind of along for the ride. He helps out some, but God doesn't give Samuel because of Elkanah's faith. God gives Samuel because of Hannah's faith, and he gives the answer to that. And Samuel brings the end of the judges and the beginning of the prophets, and Samuel gets to anoint David, from which the Messiah, Jesus, comes eventually. So a lot comes because of the faith of Hannah that we see. And so God is not rewarding or blessing Elkanah's polygamy or his sin with this, but he's rewarding the faith of Hannah. And she was doing as much as she could to serve God in spite of the circumstances she found herself in. And so that's what we see so often in this, that no matter the situations that people are put in, if they will have faith and they will be obedient to God, God will bring them through or make the best out of a terrible arrangement there. And so that's what, with this example, that their family It still wasn't pleasant, and probably Samuel did a lot better than others because he was not raised in his household. He was raised by Eli, which that's a completely other deal of how he gets brought to one of the worst parents in all of the scripture, and yet he turns out great. Samuel turns out great, even though he was raised by Eli, one of the whoever gets a letter F in the grade for being the worst parent in all of scripture, it might be Eli. Yet Samuel turns out fine in spite of that. But raised by Eli in the tabernacle, so he's not with all of his half-brothers and half-sisters, so that saved him some of that family conflict that always comes because of this. So possibly that. So there's those examples, as messed up as they are, but we'll look at David's example, which is even more extreme and more sad in a lot of ways. We'll check that out next week, and then Solomon on the tail end of that. So we do have, in 2 weeks, we're not going to have midweek service the week of Thanksgiving. We are going to have family communion. If you haven't signed up yet, there's a sign-up list there all Sunday afternoon and all day Monday. Anyone who wants to do family communion can sign up. We did just pour out the grape juice from last Christmas, so I know some of y'all were maybe wanting to branch a little beyond Baptist there in some of our communion practices, but so sorry to disappoint you, but we did pour it out. So we do have fresh grape juice from the store to use for communion coming up. So any questions on polygamy or anything? Yes, Sister Jean. Yes.
I was curious, who buried Abraham and Sarah and Rebecca and Leah? Who buried them?
Yeah, well, Jacob buried Leah, and that's what he was the one talking to Joseph, saying, "I buried Leah here." Jacob and Esau together buried Isaac. It doesn't say who buried Rebecca. Abraham buried Sarah. Kind of sad. The wives are always dying before the husbands there during that time of history, and so. But yeah, so probably Isaac buried Abraham, and each generation. So Joseph buries Jacob. When Jacob dies, Joseph and all of his brothers go back and they bury Jacob. And then Joseph, he's dead in Egypt for 400 years. And then when Moses and Joshua, when they finally leave Egypt after slavery, they take Joseph's bones with them. And finally in the book of Joshua, they finally get Joseph buried, which the Ten Commandments, watch the Ten Commandments with Charleston Heston, shows that in there, accurate. At least in that sliver, it's accurate. A lot of it's not accurate, but yeah. So any other questions? It doesn't work out. It looked like it worked out for oh yeah, man, God blessed Abraham in spite of his sin. God gave him pass. No, it does not work out. It does not. And David, it certainly does not work out big time for David, as we'll see. So let's all stand as we close in prayer.